Hello everyone, welcome back to our Spring Boot series. My previous episode was about the command line runner, and I promised that I will explain the application runner, which I call the brother of the command line runner. They both have the objective to parse input parameters from the command line, but they have a different scope. The command line runner targets regular parameters like by position, like the first parameter, second, third, usually split by or separated by a space, and when you need space, you put quotation marks around the string. The application runner is clever because he understands the types of parameters where you have a key and a value, meaning that the position of the parameters are now free. You can put the parameters wherever you want, and the application runner can get them and use them inside your application. So let's see the details of how it works and when should you apply one or the other. So first, what is the application runner? The application runner is an interface, again, like the command line runner in Spring Boot. And as I was said, allows you to parse the parameters, but let's say it's more clever than the command line runner. By the way, it exists since the version 1.3 of the Spring Boot, which is quite old, but quite useful. So how does it work? The first thing, it works, if you saw my previous video about command line runner, it works on the same way. You have the option to define it as a bin, like a component where you implement an interface called application runner, and of course you have to override the run method, or you can use the to create a bin in a configuration file or in a configuration class, which is a kind of an aggregated set of bins, and you return the application runner type, and it works similar to the command line runner as a lambda. So you have the arguments and you have the implementation of the lambda, and you return this lambda, and the Spring Boot will decide when to execute them. Sometimes people wonder why it's not executing in place. That's because you can have multiple of them, and you can even choose the order by using the annotation order. The annotation order, it's not an annotation that you should use for application runner or command line runner. It's a generic annotation in Spring Boot where you can define the order of the initialization of any bin. And since the application runner and the command line runner are treated as regular bins, so you can apply this annotation. What I mean is that the order, it's not exclusive or an extension or a specific annotation for the runners or the application runners or command line runners. It is for any bin in Spring Boot. So let's see a basic implementation, and it should be easy for you to understand this. So if you are using this application runner in a component, meaning that you define at a class level, you should implement the interface, of course, application runner, and since it is an interface, you are obligated to implement or override the methods on the interface. And of course, you put here the run, and you can see here that you are not receiving an array or a list of string args. You now receive application arguments, which is a data type that it's clever, that can understand regular parameters or parameters in the kind of let's say key value, and sometimes only the key with specific symbols that we'll see in a moment. So it's the big difference between the application runner and the command line runner. It's the parameters here on the run. The other things that's quite similar. If you switch here the application runner for command line runner, the name of the method here, it's the same, and of course the data type here will be different, but internally it's the same, and you can use the arguments as you wish. And you can see, I will talk in a moment, and I will go into more details in a moment. And you can see here that you have this kind of methods that can help you to understand what type of parameters exist on your application. You can see here the args.get option names. It means that these are specific types of arguments that you can pass to your application. But let's see some examples so you can understand better. Let's say you have a jar, your Spring Boot application, and you are running like this. Java jar target the Java archive for your application, and you can see here two types of arguments. One, it is this one, that it's only understood correctly by the application runner, and these two, arg1 and arg2, representing two different parameters with any string, any number, wherever you want to put it here. and they are understood by both application runner and command line runner. And you can ask, so this parameter will also be read by the command line runner? Yes, but the command line runner will see here three strings, the arg1, the arg2, and this string as is. It doesn't understand this key here and this value here. But the application runner understand these parameters at two different sets. One, it's the no arg parameters, which are these ones, and these ones are a special one when he understands this part, which is the name of a parameter that can have or not an equals and a value. So at the end of the day, the application runner understands this. And one big advantage for this application runner is that you can put this parameter in any position, because the application runner will understand if you ask for a parameter that it's called foo and you want its value. If it's on the first position, second position, third position, it's not important. That's one advantage of the application runner if you prefer to use this kind of parameters. Imagine that you want to load a configuration file and you just want to provide these two symbols, then config equals and the name of your file. And it doesn't matter in which position of the parameters it's deployed, because you can always get it. It's one of the great things about it, so you don't care about the position of the arguments. And on the command line runner, it's different because it works similar or almost equal to the main or the regular Java main when it receives parameters, where you should know in advance all the positions. You should even be careful about if there are parameters or not, to avoid the kind of null pointer exceptions, or you are targeting a specific position on an array that doesn't exist. So let's see more examples about this. First, let me talk a little bit about the life cycle, because you have to understand when are these runners executed, so you understand what can you use or what you cannot use in your application. So when you start your application, the first thing that happens, and in any Spring Boot application, it's to load the application context, where all the beans and all the graphs that contains all the dependencies and all your definitions exist. Then the bean starts to be initialized, and when you initialize beans, you have, for instance, the post construct. You have something that you can even implement specific interfaces, and you have some callbacks for something that you want to do even before the bean is completely initialized. Then the command line runners are executed. Remember that you have two options. One, it's the command line runners, and the other are the application runners, and you can use both at the same time. But for your understanding, the command line runners are executed first. I believe that's because it's very similar to the main and it's easy to execute them. So there is not, let's say it's not necessary any pre-processing from the Spring Boot. It just takes the arguments that are arriving at the main and provide all these arguments also to any command line runner that you have in your application. After these ones are executed, then Spring Boot will try to find the application runners if they exist, and if they exist, they will be executed. And then, of course, there is the event, meaning that application ready event, it's ready, and your application it's fully started and ready to be used. Meaning that before your application is completely ready, you have the option to execute your code, initialize your code, import, register your service, connect to external systems, check for existence of things, throw exceptions, stop the start in the event that something is not right, and so on and so on. But understand here what's important is that these command line runners are executed after the initialization of the beans, meaning that you can inject any bean because it's already initialized, and the application runner is executed after the command line runner. So let's see some more information about the arguments. Let's say we are using a component. We want this application run to be the first to be executed, and we can see here the order one. The order one, it's not scoped to the application runners. It's scoped to all the components on your application, but you want for this to be the first one to be executed. So you have to override the run method, and you can see here that I can ask about, is the debug option there? And when I'm talking about this option, it's those that we saw previously, like these ones with this format. I'm asking if there is a debug. I'm not asking if there is a value or not. It's not mandatory to have an equals value, but this left part it's one that it's important for the application runner. The second part, it's not. The second part, let's say it's a bonus. You can ask for a value if it exists for this one. By the way, when you don't provide a value, somehow the internal application runner consider that it's a boolean. So if it exists, it's true. If it doesn't exist, the value is false. Meaning that here it's if it contains the option debug, so I want debug on my application. If you and you can ask, okay, what about the other parameters like these ones? How can I get them using the application runner, since now it's not about the position? In those cases, you can use the get no option args. So you have the option args and you have the no option args, and these ones are the other ones. You just take them and you do whatever you want in the order they appear, because they don't have specific names and they don't have a way for the application runner to understand to which name to give to one of them. These ones, you can understand the names because they are prefixed with these two symbols here. The other ones are not prefixed with any kind of symbol. Okay, so again, when you execute like this, you have then two types of arguments, the option arguments, which are these ones, and the no option arguments. Again, all of these three arguments are understood by both application runner and command line runner, but the application runner understands better these kind of ones because he understands this left part and this one. And the command line runner see this as a completely regular string. At the end of the day, you can implement your own application runner using a command line runner. If you check in your parameters, if you have something that contains an equal and starts with these two symbols, and then you extract this and this, and you have the value. But why bother to do that if you already have the application runner to do that? Okay. If you want to use lists, you can put something like this. So users equals Alice, users equals Bob. And when you do something like get option values, when you think there are more than one value, it returns to you a list with both values. So you do, because otherwise you start to think maybe it's an ambiguity because there is more than one. But when the application runner understands that it's more than one, he understands that probably you want a list. I will not say that it's the best approach. Maybe you want to put something Alice and then the Bob with a comma between them, and then you split and create your own list. But sometimes people prefer this way because it's clear on the parameters intention of each one of the values. So as I said previously, since the application runner work at a component level, you can always inject whatever you want. So at the end of the day, you can inject a data source and you can, let's say, okay, try to find an argument to say, do I want to see the database, initialize the database, which database do I want to see it or get some values? And of course, since it's already here, remember that the application runner run after the bins are initialized. That's why you already have access to any bin that was initialized. So you have access to every bin that exists on an application, including access to the database. So you are free to use the database or external systems that you initialized in any bin. So, okay, let's jump over this one. Again, that is where I talk about the component. You can define an application bin as a bin also. And let's see how can we do it. So in this case, you have this configuration here, and you can define the bin as a regular bin if you return an application runner. And again, you have it will not execute this. Sometimes people don't understand this when they don't understand yet how lambdas work. What is, remember that application runner, it's a lambda, it's an interface, it's not an implementation. The implementation, the implementation for this interface, it is this code where the args are the input parameter, and this is the body of the method, meaning that this bin will return this content. And you say, why is not executed here? If you check my previous video about scopes, you start to understand, because the scope defines when a bin is created and when a bin is destroyed. And this is a singleton, and probably it will be initialized. It will be created an instance of the application runner, application starts. But imagine if this bin was not a singleton, but it was a web request. The scope was web request or the request of an HTTP, meaning that only when a HTTP request happens, the bin is created. It means that it only makes sense to execute this code when there is a request. So it's not, that's the reason that it returns a lambda, returns a future execution, and it doesn't execute when this bin is initialized. Okay, but yes, you can say, okay, you are saying differently the same thing, but the bin will be initialized at some point depending on the scope, and that's when this code will be executed. Until then, it's just code. It's here, it's recognized by the Spring context, but it's not executed until it is really necessary under the context of the scope of the bin. If it's an application, if it's a session, imagine that it's a session. Only when there is a session on your application, this code will be executed. Until then, it's just an object that it's created, but the method run, which is the method that is behind the scenes here, will only be executed when it is really necessary. You don't see here the run, but if you return back here, you can see when you implement this interface, which is the same one that you are using in the bin, you have to override the method run. So in the Lambda, this is the args, and here it's the body, meaning that behind the scenes here, the Spring Boot will execute the method run and will inject as the parameters these args, and as the body of the run, this code here. Okay, just a kind of a lesson about how lambdas work behind the scenes. Sometimes people have difficult to understand that a lambda is just a data type. It's like when you define a variable. It's only when it's necessary to use it that will be executed. The same for a variable. You can create a value, but later you will assign a value to it and use it in an expression or something, and then that's when this value will be collected from the variable where it resides. When to use the application runner, initialization tasks, it's like the command line runner, like database migrations, cache warming, meaning initializing cache, or any setup after the context load. Imagine that you have to prepare some files, create empty files, create a folder, or check if a folder exists, or maybe want to register your application in, let's say, in a central system, saying, okay, I'm alive. It's quite common in microservice architecture for a service when it starts to register itself, saying, I'm here, and then you have a kind of a heartbeat saying, let's say every 30 seconds, it just, let's say, pings the central server, say, I'm alive. So the server, when someone needs to connect to your service, understands where you are, and he understands that you are alive, so he can send the requests to your instance. Remember that you can have multiple instances of your service running. If you need order execution, of course you can use the order. Batch processing at startup, if it's light, it's a good idea to use application runner. Otherwise, use something like cron, schedulers, quartz, other kind of batch, maybe Spring Batch. If it's heavy, don't. The application runs, and I will say the same thing that I said about the CommandLineRunner. It's great to have the application runner when you need parameters. You have to do initializations, rest yourself, but avoid long or heavy tasks, because at some point the DevOps or the system doesn't understand if your application is running or if it's just blocked for some reason, and if it takes a lot of time to load. So create a kind of a trade-off and decide, well, what do you really want to do when you are using the application runner. If it's just loading configuration files, check fast things between, let's say, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, it's okay. If it's more than that, please provide a kind of logging, explain this can take a while, and probably you want to use the async, something that I talked about in my previous session about the CommandLineRunner, which is a notation that you can put on components to explain to Spring Boot to say, okay, when this method is executing, it's asynchronous, so don't wait for it to finish. Just continue your job on your main thread. Now there is another thread executing this, and just put some logs, say, okay, this this data is being initialized, and later when it finishes, you log, because it will be useful for the DevOps people to see on the logs that it started and it was a success or not. the loading of your application. So there is a combination of factors and trade-offs that you should think about. So if you want a quick tip, avoid long executing tasks here, just small ones, fast, that can help your application to initialize. If you need longer ones and it's just one time, okay, use the async. If it's more than one time, maybe when you don't want to put on the application runner, you need something like jobs, crons, quarts, and things like that, batch that execute in parallel, even if it's inside of your application. You can have multiple runs, as I said previously. You just use the notation order if the order are important between them. Otherwise, if the important it's not relevant, Spring Boot will find the right order for your application runners or command line runners. This is a very common use case to use the application runner when you need to add additional configuration files, not the common Spring Boot file. Sometimes you need configurations to connect to external systems and can be on local file system, or maybe it's just an address to an internet point when you get some JSON file where you can find your configurations. And it's a very nice use case to use the application runner. When you should not use the application runner, simple command line arguments. If you don't need structure tags, meaning you don't need that equals, just use a command line runner, a simple one. It should be easy. If you need to execute things before the context load, there are ways in Spring Boot. Remember that the command line runner and the application runner runs after the initialization of the beans, and after the creation of the context. If you need before all of this, you should try to use the application listener or initializing beans interface on your beans. If you need pure CLI tools without Spring context, just use plain Java main method. That's the common approach. If you have critical things that you want to use and can take a lot of time, consider again to use this annotation async. By the way, if you're the first time that you are seeing this annotation async, I will talk about this annotation in a future video, but it's not, you have to provide this annotation on your method inside the component, but you also have to use an annotation called enable async on your main method in the class where your main method of your Spring Boot application. Otherwise, it will not work. Spring, when it starts, needs to understand there are async methods in the application, so it can develop its own features and proxies, things like that, to handle that type of executions. Testing scenarios, it's not a good thing to use application runner, because you can always, okay, when the application starts, I'll initialize everything for my test on the application runner. It's wrong. Usually the test framework already provide a way, call it setup, and they have annotations for you to initialize data when it's necessary. And again, if you have long running tasks and if they run regularly and more than once, maybe you should ask yourself, maybe it's better to use the schedule annotation and framework that exists inside the Spring Boot. So let's see a real world case example, a quite simple one. So you implement here the application runner. Again, you can use a regular bin. It's not mandatory for you to use as a component. And again, you can, for instance, you have a kind of a discovery client. You want to register your service in a discovery service that tells the other service who are the other services, so you can communicate between services without knowing where they are, their IP address and things like that, just by name. So in your environment, you let's say you provide something like env, let's say production or the development or other name that you want, and you register on this client, in this discovery client. And now when another service wants to discover you, just ask to the discover client, where are you? And it can find you because you register yourself there. That's a good use case for the application runner. And for instance, imagine that you have something like environment production. Maybe you want to put some IP address and other things here to help the discovery client to help the others to discover your service. So this is if you want to, let's say, initialize for a DB. This is another popular use case where you provide this parameter init database equals true. Okay, now you parse. The application runner will parse for you this parameter. You just need to check if this parameter exists and what is the value. You don't have to parse it. If it's a boolean or integer, it will be done for you by the application runner. And then if it's true, of course, you initialize the schema. Otherwise, you just don't do it. It's just a simple one just to show you some use case that you can use on the application runner. Best practice for application runner, keep it lightweight. Again, I have talked a lot about this in the previous slides. Handle exceptions and decide if you want to throw an exception or just log about what's happening. It depends if it's really required by your application, this initialization, or it's just a nice to have that you can try or retry again later and do it again. Use order wisely for dependencies between runners. It can be applied to every bin. In Spring Boot, test separately. Unit test the run method by mocking application arguments. It's something that comes outside of your application. It's always dangerous. So make sure that unit test, you validate, and you really protect your application. It's not that sometimes it's not that can have people that say, okay, I have to protect my application from hackers and attacks. I will say that most of the time that's not the issue. The issue is human error. Someone can pass something that it's not right and can break your application. By mistake, by bad documentation, there are a lot of reasons to fail and to provide wrong parameters. And you have to make sure that your application is defensive and should protect itself from external errors. For log, you can use SL4J for proper logging instead of the system out. And you can, if you see my previous video about CommandLineRunner, you can always use this annotation conditional on property. If you have properties, meaning that you can option to initialize a bin or not based on a value of a property, which means that since if you go back here, this is a component, and if you use that annotation here, and you decide not to initialize this component because of a property value, it means that this code will never be executed because it will not, if this bin is not initialized, of course, this method will never run. That's one way to avoid order and be more strict about when this application runner makes sense to be used or not. Maybe you have a property to say in production, I don't need application runners and command line runners, but in development quality, they are useful because I have to connect to systems, get information, and things like that. That's one use case where this conditional property can be useful on your application. Common pitfalls, be careful that. Arg passing errors, always check if the options exist to avoid null pointer exceptions. That's why you see in all my examples, if exists, then gets the value. Order conflicts, if not using order, execution is not deterministic. It's not a problem if there are no intersections between what the application runners are doing. Heavy tasks, avoid it. Again, I talk a lot about that. Forgotten component or bin, runner won't be detected without. I can speak for myself. There were a lot of times I was completely desperate about why it's not working, and sometimes I just forgot to put the annotation component or bin on a method or on a class. Overuse, not for every init, prefer post-construct for bin level init. As you know, all the bins in Spring Boot, you can create methods with this annotation post-construct, which is to initialize something about that bin in that specific bin, and it can even have access to the private things on the bin. So prefer the post-construct if it's something local to the bin. If it's something more transversal, probably we'll need the application runner or the command line runner. So this is a table to compare. I provided in my previous video something similar. This one, you can just pause the video here if you want to read it and understand better. But both are interface method. The only difference is this argument, application arguments. This is the one. Command line run, it's the same as used for the main application. The argument handling, this is structured because it uses application arguments. He understands each type of the argument. Command line run, they are just strings. Use case for the application runner, tasks needing parsed arguments, Spring specific. Command line run, it's simple CLI tasks, no parsing needed. Execution order, it's always after the command line runner. Of course, this is before. Complexity, it's more flexible for complex arguments. This is simpler for basic needs. Dependency injection, both of them. Run has been, so you can inject whatever you want. When to choose, prefer for arg heavy apps when you would need a lot of arguments and they have a kind of a semantic meaning. So it's better to use application runner on those cases. Command line runner is just simple things, simple parameters that you want to receive. You want to use the command line runner. So this is what I want to talk about application runner. Now I will provide you a real example where you see both command line runner and the application runner. My example, it's based on my previous video, which is a command line runner, but I'm adding here the application runner, so you will see both at the same time working. So let's see, I defined at least two of them. So you can see here the application runner, I'm calling helper. It's not a good name, but it's enough for our example. Implements the application runner. I'm injecting here an entity service. There's a table with entities with ID and names, just for us to check this working. And what I'm doing is I'm overriding the method run, and now I'm checking if there is a parameter called display, okay, and contains the entities. It means that I want to display all the entities that exist in database. Since all the bins are injected, this is just a service I will call, and there is also an entities repository that you can explore here on this project. By the way, this project on GitHub, you can see on the channel, on the posts, I have an address of this on the GitHub. You can clone it and explore this code. And of course, there is the entities repository here. If you try to find it here, and they have a method to get to the database and get some data, and database as data is, I'm using an H2 database, so you don't have to install anything on your machine. Everything works in memory. And this is one way to use the application runner. The other way is to use like this as a bin. And here it's the same thing as the other, but here I'm printing all the no option arguments and the option arguments, so you can see how the application runner can understand both of them. So we have a way to display the arguments that are handled by application runner and the regular ones. By the way, here on the code, it's my previous video where you can see the command line runner, and you can see 1 here, 2 here. I'm using the order. I'm not putting any order here, but you will see that these are executed first, and then the application run is executed, as I explained in the slides. And the parameters that I'm passing to the application, you can see here, this is a regular one, and this is a special one that it's understood by the application runner, which is called display, and it's equal entities, which, by the way, it's the one that you saw here. So if the args contains the option display and the values are entities, it means that I want to get all the entities and print them on the output. So let's play this and see this working. I'll just push this. So the application is starting. It should be quite fast. So this one, it's from the command line runner. This second, if you go to the code, it also belongs. This is for the application runner. This is the second one. I will show you here. This is the first one. Get all categories. That's why you are seeing here the print of all the categories here. Okay. Then this is the second one here, the order 2, and it's creating an entity, just that contains the parameter. If you check my previous video, you will understand. And it will create an entity with this description here. And then now the application runners will execute. And you can see here, it's the .3, which is this one, will start to execute. But before that, it was executed this one. Okay, and you can see here that it displays all the entities, and the entity was created with that parameter that I was talking about. Okay, this is this one. And then the application runner executed and display as I asked it for the no option args, and he understood it is this one. By the way, if you don't remember, it is this way. This is a no option arg, and this is a option arg here, which is, and it puts like the display equal entities. And so this is the argument, which is called display with the value entities. And you can see that it treats this as a kind of a list. And even if we have only one, it means if I put more of them, you will see here the list of them. It's not me that I'm writing these brackets here, these rectangular brackets. You can see here on the code that I'm not doing that, but it's being displayed as a kind of a list. Okay, and now everything is executed. So you have these options: the application runner, command line runner, and you already know the difference when to use one Or the other, if you want sophisticated parameters, use application run. If you need simple parameters, use the command line runner. If you are using a legacy application, it's probably that you have to use both. Sometimes people, okay, if I have application run, why should I use this one? Sometimes people think that they always start an application from zero. I don't remember now on the my latest job, I did a lot of applications from zero, but sometimes it's very improbable. There are a lot of applications that are being redefined, introducing AI, being refactored to new technologies, and most of the time you are inheriting a lot of legacy applications, and it's probably that some of them were using command line runner, and now you need to use application runner. Rather than replace them, just add a new one and handle as you need the application runner and add your own parameters. So I hope this video was useful for you. Now you understand both ways to execute code when your application starts, command line runner and application runner. And it was nice to have you here. I hope you subscribe my channel, and thank you for watching.